So let's get started. Thanks for coming today. So before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are now gathering on the lands of the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And today we are very happy and honored to have Dr. Kaitlyn Gaynor, who is an assistant professor in the departments of zoology and botany at the University of British Columbia. And she's a faculty in IRES as well. So her research examines the effects of human activity on large terrestrial mammals with emphases on behavioral responses of animals to human presence, the effects of anthropogenic disturbance on predator-prey and other species interactions, and the socio-ecological dynamics of conservation and coexistence. Her work involves large-scale data synthesis and meta-analysis, and local field studies in North America, Africa, and Asia. So without further ado, I'll yield to Dr. Kaitlyn.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of the IRES community. And I welcome the opportunity to share a little bit about what our lab is doing with you all. And I am coming to you as a behavioral ecologist, first and foremost. My training was in animal behavioral ecology. And there's this fundamental principle that all animals are balancing resource acquisition with risk avoidance as they decide where to go and what to do. These trade-offs underpin every decision an animal makes. I took this picture when I was in Tanzania a couple of years ago of these water buck that were just slowly chewing this grass as this lioness got closer and closer and closer, deciding like, when do I stop chewing and run away? But she had, you can't really see them, she had two adorable cubs that were not letting her hunt. So she ended up, yeah, giving them a swat, and the water buck lived to see another day. But as we're all well aware, animals now are constantly making decisions against a growing backdrop of human disturbance. Humans are transforming every corner of this planet. This is an illustration of the global human footprint, which represents the terrestrial built environment, but even the remotest parts of our lands and our oceans are affected by anthropogenic climate change and other disturbances. And so against this global human footprint, growing human population, growing human impact, it's really critical and urgent that we understand how our presence and our activity shapes other species. And it's well documented that human disturbance is resulting in less biodiversity and defaunation, fewer animals, through overexploitation, habitat destruction, introduction of invasive species and diseases, pollution, climate change, you name it. And for many species, especially vertebrates, a very high proportion of species are declining. But what about the animals that are still here? How are they navigating these altered environments amidst changing resources and changing risks and new constraints on their behavior? And so that's the question that I will be exploring with you today. What are the spatial and temporal responses of large mammals to human disturbance? And what might that mean for human-wildlife coexistence on an increasingly crowded planet? And I'm going to talk through a handful of case studies that have implications for human-wildlife coexistence. Now, in a review paper led a few years back by my colleague Molly Wilson, we explored why this question might matter. So human disturbance in all those myriad forms I just listed can change those risks, resources, and other aspects of habitat suitability, which then alters patterns of animal movement, foraging, sociality, anti-predator behavior. Animals are doing different things. But so what? Whether those behavioral changes are adaptive or maladaptive, they can have costs that impact individual fitness and populations and species interactions. And a lot of the behaviors that animals perform serve important ecological functions like nutrient cycling or seed dispersal, which could potentially alter ecosystem services and have consequences for the ways that ecosystems function and the people that live in those ecosystems. And we still don't know a lot about these pathways. Anything in a dotted line as of 2020, there was really no evidence for. And if I'm being honest, a lot of the solid lines, the evidence is kind of so-so. So a lot of this is speculative, but it could matter. And one of the pathways that we work on a lot in my lab is this perceived risk pathway. So people are scary. We instill fear in animals. Often we do pose a threat, but sometimes we don't. They're still scared of us. And so going back to that importance of risk-reward trade-offs, people are adding a major source of risk. And we can draw on knowledge from the study of predator-prey interactions to understand how that risk might shape animal behavior. And I think a lot about the concept of the landscape of fear. This idea that animals experience some spatial heterogeneity in risk, and that influences where they go and what they do in a given place. So in natural predator-prey systems, these landscapes of fear arise as a result of like a predator's hunting strategy, interacting with how that prey avoids that predator, and interacting with the structure of the habitat. And humans modify these landscapes of fear in many different ways, but one of them is by being scary ourselves. And so in these anthropogenic landscapes of fear, animals often entirely avoid areas with a high degree of human disturbance, even if there is suitable habitat for them there. And so spatial partitioning, we can think of it actually as a mechanism for coexistence between animals and people. But of course, it's becoming harder to avoid us in space as we're taking up more of it. And yeah, sometimes humans are in high quality habitat that we want animals to be using. This led us to the question, if animals are increasingly unable to avoid humans in space as we're taking up more of it, might animals all over the world be adjusting their daily activity patterns to avoid humans in time in spaces where we coexist? And we were seeing this a lot throughout the published scientific literature, some evidence that animals were more active at night when they were around people. And so this prompted my co-authors and I to do a meta-analysis and see how widespread this effect was and understand how human disturbance affects large mammal diel activity patterns. And we looked at 141 case studies around the world of any large mammal, anything larger than 5 kilos. And in these case studies, we were comparing how animal activity varied in kind of these more natural areas that served as a control and some kind of area or time period with higher human disturbance. So these are just some examples. So comparing when animals were active. And for each of these disturbance levels, we calculated nocturnality, really simply just the percentage of the animal's activity that took place at night. We defined it differently based on how they quantified activity in the study. But these are the baseline levels for all those 141 case studies. Wide range of typical nocturnal behaviors. Some species were pretty diurnal, active during the day, others pretty nocturnal. And then if you look at under high human disturbance conditions, those same species, over 80% of them became more nocturnal in response to humans. And we did the meta-analysis and found mammals were on average 1.36 times more nocturnal in response to human disturbance. So to put that in context, an animal that split its activity 50-50 between the day and night would become 68% nocturnal under human disturbance. And we saw this increase in nocturnality across all trophic levels, from big apex carnivores, prey species, and mammals of all body sizes as well, with a slight trend towards greater responses in larger bodied mammals, which might find it harder to avoid humans in space. And surprisingly, the pattern also held across different types of human disturbance, including activities like hunting, hiking, mountain biking, and infrastructure like roads, residential settlement, and agriculture, this increase in nocturnal activity. So suggesting it's not just they're responding to night lights or other kinds of disturbance, even transient, non-lethal human disturbance could cause this behavioral shift. So what does that mean? We really don't yet understand the consequences of this behavioral shift, and it raises a lot of important questions for future research. For one, many of these animals may have evolved adaptations to living in the daylight, and we might expect them to have trouble finding food, avoiding predators, communicating, finding mates in the dark. Could affect survival or reproduction, but this is kind of an open question. Of course, if there is kind of this selective pressures, we might see selection for morphological, physiological, behavioral adaptations to nighttime activity. So animals kind of evolving the ability to be more effective at night. Maybe this is already happening, but this is purely in the realm of speculation. And by altering typical activity patterns in one species, disturbance could have far-reaching consequences for ecosystems. So in California's Santa Cruz Mountains, for example, coyotes are becoming more nocturnal in areas with recreation. And studies have linked this behavioral change in coyotes to changes in their diet. So they're shifting from eating more diurnal things like songbirds and squirrels to more nocturnal things like rats. And it has implications for small mammal communities and also for their niche partitioning with other mesopredators. So I think that the glass half full take on this is that the global increase of nocturnality among wildlife in human dominated areas demonstrates a high degree of behavioral plasticity, and that temporal partitioning might be a mechanism for coexistence on an increasingly crowded planet if animals were able to meet their needs, but just by shifting their activity a bit and avoid encounters with people that could be dangerous for people and for animals. But of course, the glass half empty side is not all animals are willing or able to just switch to a nocturnal lifestyle and thrive. And those that avoid human disturbance entirely in both space and time, which are not even a part of this study, are of course the most vulnerable to that expanding human footprint. So I've been talking a lot about risk, but despite perceptions of risk, animals often seek out areas of high human activity because of some rewards. So high quality, accessible food resources like crops, livestock, refuse, or pizza rat. Although I think this is fake, but the point stands. And so the next question is, how do animals then trade off this risk and benefit associated with human disturbance? And I've talked about spatial partitioning and temporal partitioning as ways for animals to navigate the human footprint. But for some species, you might see behavioral adjustments at relatively fine spatial temporal scales, where during the daytime, animals seek out areas of lower human activity. And during the night, they move into more human-dominated areas to take advantage of those resources. And so this is something we've looked at in Mozambique and Gorongosa National Park, which is a study system that my lab has been working in. I've been working in for a while. And it hosts a diversity of large mammal species, the largest of which is the African elephant. And elephants have very flexible activity patterns, very large home range sizes. They are very sensitive to human disturbance in this area, and humans are very sensitive to elephant disturbance in this area. And we looked at the effects of two types of disturbance on the landscape: roads and inside the park, and settlements that were located just outside the park, using camera traps to look at when elephants were active and where. And so in the context of roads, elephants associate roads with risk in this system. Elephants fear vehicles. There's been a long history of poaching, but roads also do provide some benefit to elephants. They make it easy for these animals to move long distances across dense landscapes and reduce the cost of locomotion. And a lot of the roads in this area, and actually much of the African continent, were first created by elephants. They kind of broke the trails for us first. And so what we looked at was we looked at how often we were seeing elephants on cameras off of roads and on roads. And what we saw was that at any given road versus these sites on trails off roads, there were more elephants. They're definitely using the roads to move. But then we looked at when they were using the roads. So at those sites off of roads, they were moving around more in the middle of the day. Whereas on the roads, we saw a dip in the daytime and relatively more movement on the roads in the night, which is when the vehicles are not on those roads. And so what does this mean? It's potentially beneficial when we think about spatio-temporal partitioning as a way to reduce human-wildlife conflict and interactions, specifically in the form of vehicle collisions. So this is a picture, unfortunately, of my truck after I came upon an elephant during the day in the roads. They are sometimes there, who didn't want me there. And she let us know. And, you know, so if the elephants are on the roads more at night, then we can avoid things like this. But of course, avoidance of vehicles isn't entirely positive. You know, tourists want to see elephants safely, and people want to study them, and maybe elephants do want to be moving around on the roads during the day. So potentially some downsides as well, but I think mostly an upside, in my opinion. And we then looked at the effects again of settlements. And again, when we think about settlements, they present some risk to elephants. Elephants don't want to come in contact with people who may very understandably chase them away or harass them. But settlements provide a great potential reward to elephants. These are agricultural settlements, and elephants can access really high quality food resources in the form of crops. And they're known to leave the park and forage on crops. Similar to the case with the roads, we found elephants were leaving the park. We were detecting them more on the cameras at the park's edge. This isn't necessarily because they're spending more time out there. It's more of just a product of where the cameras were, but they're leaving the park. But when they are doing it, so if you look again, this is their activity over the 24-hour period. Inside the park, they're kind of active all the time, maybe a little bit more during the day, but they are never in the settlements during the day. And as soon as the sun goes down, that's when we see a big peak in their activity. So again, we see this spatiotemporal partitioning. What does this mean then for human-wildlife interactions? In this case, while nocturnal activity for elephants, the elephants are winning out, they're able to go and eat all of the maize they want. It's of course devastating for the farmers who can lose their entire year's food supply in a single night. And human-elephant conflict like this is a major problem in this region and much of Africa and Asia as well. And so what can we do about this? Well, what my colleagues are trying to do is go back to that principle of risk-reward trade-offs and think about how we can pull on that risk lever a little bit more and try and make that force stronger than the reward. And so what they're doing is using these beehive fences that have become popular in Africa, where these are just beehives hung on these strings that swing. So when an elephant hits this rope, the beehive will jiggle and the bees will fly out and harass the elephants. And believe it or not, the elephants are terrified of bees and they will turn around or they'll go around the fence. So it's one of those things that often just displaces the problem. But it's something we think about is how can we use that principle of applying our understanding of the ecology of fear to try to manage undesirable interactions. So just to sum that up, we see animals might be drawn to areas of human disturbance, but use them at times of day when people are less active, balancing the risk and opportunity. And that resulting reduction in spatiotemporal overlap between people and wildlife, it could facilitate coexistence or it could increase conflict, really depending on this particular situation. So that case study highlights how animals are balancing fear of humans with benefits associated with humans. And all around the world, animals are facing these novel risk-reward trade-offs. And now I want to explore how these trade-offs might vary between individual animals based on an animal's experience with human disturbance. So kind of the next question I want to get into is not every animal is going to look at this situation the same way. And one of the reasons for this is habituation. So habituation through repeated benign exposure to humans might reduce an animal's fear of humans, and they might no longer avoid humans. And this is really evident in this photo taken in Glacier National Park of a mountain goat, who clearly there's not much fear here of this forest. But alternatively, repeated negative experiences with humans, like hunting or aversive conditioning when you're trying to instill fear in animals, might drive sensitization, where the fear becomes enhanced. And this might lead to even stronger avoidance of people. And this would be the case for those elephants in Mozambique who have learned to fear humans after decades of poaching. And habituation might also feed into synanthropy, so the association of human disturbance with some benefits, where animals that become habituated might then learn to take advantage of resources, and you get this kind of feedback loop where they just get more habituated and reap the benefits. Or they might first learn to find the human food, and then over time, habituation might kick in. And so I was interested, my colleagues and I were interested in how might these trade-offs affect habitat selection, which is to say, how are animals moving around areas with spatially variable human disturbance as a function of their exposure to it. So we might expect, okay, if an animal fears humans, it's going to avoid disturbance. So some area with high human disturbance. We consider this like negative selection. Whereas an animal that is synanthropic, that reaps some benefit from disturbance, will prefer it. But given that, as I said, exposure can shape responses to disturbance, we might expect wildlife to exhibit a functional response in habitat selection. And I'll break down what I mean by that. A functional response is just when selection for a particular environmental feature changes as a function of the availability of that feature in the animal's environment. And this idea is borrowed from predator-prey theory, where predator consumption rates of prey change as a function of its availability. But I'll draw this out graphically for you. So In that context of human disturbance, we might expect some individual variation in selection to be explained by exposure. So values on the left side of this axis would be an animal kind of in the wilderness, very low exposure to disturbance. And on the right would be animals living in very, very developed areas, urban animals. If there's no effect of exposure on disturbance, animals uniformly perceive risk. We would see a kind of flat line that all animals, regardless of their experience, are going to avoid disturbance. But on the other hand, if animals are sensitized to disturbance, we might see that, or sorry, if they habituate to disturbance, we would see that that avoidance would disappear with high exposure. So maybe, more neutral selection once they kind of get used to people. But on the other hand, if they are sensitized to disturbance, we might see that the more an individual is exposed, the more they avoid it. And really the intercepts of these lines don't matter so much. You could draw this lower, but really it's the slope that would indicate habituation or sensitization. And this is something we're starting to see now in studies of animal habitat selection. So this is a recent study that found a response consistent with sensitization among mountain lions across California. So these mountain lions, they experience very high rates of human-caused mortality. And the individual animals with higher predicted mortality in their home range avoided more strongly human disturbance at fine scales within their home range. Meanwhile, for just a subpopulation of California mountain lions that was exposed, in this case, not so much to lethal disturbance, but really just benign recreation, we saw this relationship flip and something consistent with habituation, where the animals that were exposed very infrequently to recreation avoided trails and areas of recreation, whereas those that were exposed a lot no longer avoided it so much, so evidence of habituation. Now, if we think about those synanthropic animals, the animals that are benefiting from humans, we might expect consistent positive association with humans, or we might see some interaction with habituation, where the animals in the wilderness fear humans and avoid any disturbance that they encounter, and animals that are exposed a lot actually start to preferentially use areas of high human disturbance. Okay, so kind of set this up conceptually. We explored these questions, testing these hypotheses within national parks in the United States to try to understand how large mammals in protected areas respond to human disturbance. Now, the US National Park Service, like a lot of park services, has a mission to conserve wildlife and wild lands and also provide for recreation opportunities for present and future generations. And this dual mandate is common, but it is becoming harder to reconcile given rapid increases to visitation, particularly just within the last decade. And this raises questions about the impacts of visitors and human use on the wildlife that we're meant to be conserving in those parks. Now, recreation, of course, is one of the most compatible land use types with conservation, but outdoor recreation and the built environment that supports it does have well-documented negative effects on wildlife and ecosystems. So in this study, what we did was we compiled GPS telemetry to assess the responses of animals to spatially variable human disturbance in parks and see how those responses varied across individuals and populations. And so we used GPS tracking data from 20 different populations of large mammals in 14 parks, spanning 10 species, a mix of carnivores and ungulates. And this effort was possible only because a huge number of scientists and managers actually went out and tracked these animals. And so what we did was to just kind of simplify our inference. We created this aggregate measure of the human footprint in protected areas. I'm calling it the human footprint. It's very similar to that map that I showed at the beginning of the talk with that global human footprint, similar idea, but at a much, much finer spatial resolution. So we looked at the features that were in protected areas that animals might be responding to. I'll spare you the methods, but we built this, this footprint layer. And then we used resource selection functions that compare all of the locations that an animal used to the ones that were available to them, so that we can then ask, are they disproportionately using areas of higher human footprint or avoiding them? Or are they just using them proportional to their availability? And what we found, as we expected, we ran these models and we allowed this selection to vary across individuals, was a lot of variation. Some individuals selected for disturbance, others against it, others neutral. And so we then did a second step of modeling to look at that functional response. And so we modeled an individual's response to that human footprint as a function of the mean footprint in its home range. So how exposed it was to the footprint, to try and see if we could create some of these figures. And so when we threw all of the animals in together, we see a slightly negative functional response, maybe consistent with risk avoidance, sensitization, kind of negative association with the footprint. And however, we saw a lot of intraspecific variation. We saw a lot of interspecific variation in terms of the intraspecific variation. Sorry, let me walk you through what I mean by that. So some species functional responses were consistent with a combination of synanthropy and sensitization. So the red dotted line that we're seeing here means like no effect of the footprint on habitat selection. And the two species we're looking at here, black bear and mule deer, reap some benefits from association with humans. Like there might be good forage around people, there might be safety from dominant predators, but there does seem to be some breaking point for these bears and mule deer where the more they are exposed, they weaken their selection for it. But elk, on the other hand, showed signs of habituation, like very, very consistent with that prediction, where elk that were in areas with lower disturbance avoided it, and those in higher disturbance selected for it. Other species showed signs of habituation, like mountain lions, and other species had consistently negative responses, or negative or positive responses. So overall, we see individual animals balance risk and rewards associated with human disturbance, and the history and nature of disturbance can drive inter and intraspecific variation in responses to the human footprint. Now, we've been looking here at responses to the static human footprint, but there's growing evidence that the built environment and the actual presence of humans have distinct and sometimes contrasting effects on wildlife spatiotemporal activity, and it can be hard to tease these two things apart. And so then we asked, how do responses to human infrastructure change when humans are gone? Now, in our study, we leveraged the COVID-19 pandemic as a natural experiment to answer this question: what happens when you take people off of that human footprint? So there were many headlines back in 2020 about how wildlife and national parks were thriving during lockdowns. And so we drilled into the data to see if this was backed by the evidence or just anecdotes. So all the data that I've shown you came from 2019, when parks experienced typical visitation. But we also looked at animal movement in 2020, when parks were completely closed to visitors, looking at the same dates in both years. And we might expect this functional response to change when you take humans off the landscape. And I'll just skip ahead and show you what we found. So what we found was that on the whole, animals switched from avoiding disturbance to selecting for it when they were heavily exposed. And so what this means is that essentially the animals that had a very high footprint in their home range, when the parks closed, they switched from avoiding disturbance to actually using those areas, exploring those areas in the absence of humans, kind of in line with what we saw from the headlines. But the vast majority of animals actually didn't have too much of an effect. And something I just want to point out was that it was only when we considered individual variation that we saw some of these patterns emerge. When we ignored the functional response and just averaged across animals, it would suggest there's some universal avoidance in 2019 and really no change in 2020. But we started to see those patterns emerge when we drilled in a little closer. And so what does this mean then for conservation and human use in protected areas? The concentration of recreation activity in small portions of the landscape, I do think, likely minimizes the overall impact on populations. And many animals can relate to benign recreation, which might limit its negative effects. However, there is potential for human-wildlife conflict in areas where animals habituate and people are present. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in the couple minutes I have left, I've been talking a lot about like an individual species responses to human disturbance, but of course animals are not only responding to humans, but to many other interacting species within food webs. And this brings us to that final question, which was, how does an animal's behavioral response to human disturbance affect spatiotemporal partitioning with other species in the community? And we think about this a lot in the context of predator-prey interactions. If we have predators responding to humans, And prey also responding to humans. What does that mean for interactions between predators and prey? Or how are the predators and prey kind of trading off rewards associated with each of the other actors in this triad now? So in the absence of humans, we can think about this predator-prey space race that results in some stable degree of spatiotemporal partitioning between predators and prey. But if both predators and prey are avoiding humans, under this mutual avoidance hypothesis, they might all be squeezed into the same areas with lower human disturbance and have higher spatiotemporal overlap. And so in this context, we can think about predators are now winning the space race, the response race, and prey are losing. Alternatively, if predators avoid areas or time periods of high human disturbance, humans might then be associated with relative safety for prey. And prey may then take advantage of this human shield, and thus prey win the response race. And last year, my lab and Mike Noonan's lab at UBCO published a systematic literature review where we assessed all of the evidence that was out there for this human shield hypothesis, because it had been coming up a lot in the literature. We found almost 300 papers that discussed the human shield hypothesis. And we also looked at how papers were engaging with the human shield hypothesis. And some studies were kind of setting out to rigorously test the human shield hypothesis, but the majority were kind of discussing it as a potential explanation of the findings, implication of the findings, throwing it around. And we then dove into the papers that were drawing some inference about the human shield hypothesis. And what we found is that about 40% of the evidence was in support of the human shield hypothesis. A lot of it was neutral, and there was actually quite a bit of evidence against the human shield hypothesis. And I won't get into the nuances here. I'll say our takeaway was that this hypothesis is very frequently invoked. It's seldom tested well. It's sometimes supported, but it's often not. And this is honestly not all that surprising, given that animals are trading off so many risks and opportunities in human modified landscapes. And in this paper, we get into like all the specific set of conditions that kind of should lead to the human shield occurring. I won't get into now. But we dove into this quantitatively in another synthetic study that came out earlier this year, where we looked specifically at this mutual avoidance human shield thing on the axis of time. This is a meta-analysis led by Eamon Wooster, another big collaboration across labs. And I just want to come back to this result I showed earlier, which is that animals across trophic levels are becoming more nocturnal in response to human disturbance. So if that's the case, what might that mean for temporal overlap between predators and prey? And so we did a meta-analysis, and I guess I'll run through this quickly. I have a few. We looked at data from almost 500 species, almost 500 species, and looked at the overlap in the activity of predators and prey under low human disturbance and high human disturbance. And before I show you the results, I just want to orient you to the graph. So the right side, a positive value, means that human disturbance led to more overlap between predators and prey. The left side, less overlap. And overall, we saw a huge amount of variation with on average really no mean effect whatsoever. And where the variation started to get explained was when we looked at body size. So essentially that for smaller bodied predators, human disturbance led to more temporal overlap with prey. But for larger bodied predators, it led to less temporal overlap with prey. And the opposite pattern was true for prey. So smaller bodied prey overlap less with their predators, and larger overlap more. And I'll just take this all together. When we look at the size ratio, essentially what we're seeing is that whichever species is larger tends to lose under human disturbance. So when the prey is larger than the predator, human disturbance leads to more predator-prey overlap, bad for prey. When the predators are larger, it leads to less overlap, bad for predators. And I just want to bring you back to this graph, which showed that larger species tend to be the ones that are most sensitive to human disturbance. And so a larger bodied animal might be facing those trade-offs more strongly and avoiding humans more at the cost of overlapping in time with their predator or with their prey if you're the predator, or overlapping more if you're the prey. So what this might this mean? It might be more overlap might be bad for prey, less might be bad for predators, essentially. But I just want to conclude this by saying that looking just at spatial and temporal overlap is not the whole picture. But of course, predator and prey not only have to overlap, but they have to encounter each other, an attack has to happen and a kill has to happen. And we still have a lot to learn about the downstream consequences of human-induced changes in animal behavior, and specifically this pathway through which humans are instilling fear. We really don't yet know how much human-induced changes in perceived risk actually do affect populations and communities. But I'll say that regardless of whether subtle behavioral changes of wildlife in response to human activity actually do scale up to affect population densities or structure ecosystems, or whether they just kind of come out on the wash, I'll argue that they do have pretty important implications for the coexistence of humans and wildlife on fine spatial and temporal scales, as they might have the potential to increase or decrease human-wildlife conflict. And I'll also contend it's not just up to wildlife to change our behavior in response to us. It's also on us to think about how we can adjust our behavior in response to them so that we can better coexist on this planet for our mutual benefit. And with that, thank you for your attention.